Billionaire's autistic son was born paralyzed until the new Maid uncovered the shocking truth. Doctors predicted that a billionaire's autistic son would never recover from his birth paralysis. Experts tried everything for years, but the boy was still immobile and mute. One of the wealthiest individuals on the planet, his father did not spare any effort. He spent millions seeking solutions, engaged top-notch specialists, and constructed therapy rooms. Nothing was successful. A new maid was then employed. She was a patient and attentive person, but neither a nurse nor a doctor. But after a few weeks, she saw something that nobody else had. A minor response, a smile, a sound. She continued to watch and gradually, piece by piece, discovered the true cause of the boy's illness. Everyone was stunned by what she found, and it would forever alter the boy's life. Before continuing, I want to invite you to like the video and leave a comment from where you are watching this beautiful story. In the past, Richard Wakefield was a well-known and influential businessman worldwide. People applauded his accomplishment after seeing him on magazine covers. At 43, however, Richard was no longer the center of attention. He led a tranquil life away from cameras and interviews in a massive estate. The opulent estate felt deserted, devoid of companionship and laughter. It was a place of loneliness. Richard had worked long hours and used clever tactics to make a lot of money. However, such items had lost their significance. After his wife died, he turned all of his attention to Noah, his son. Noah was 6 years old. He had Down syndrome, autism, and a wheelchair. Richard had worked with numerous therapists, purchased the greatest equipment, and employed physicians. Despite his best efforts, Noah remained silent. Richard, who used to be tough and icy in business meetings, felt vulnerable today. More painful than any loss or failure he had ever experienced was his son's quiet. Richard did the same thing every day. He got up early, prepared his own breakfast, and assisted Noah in getting ready. With his son, he trusted no one else. Noah never gave him a glance as they were seated at a large table. Richard asked questions, talked softly, and shared little anecdotes. Noah remained silent. His gaze fixed on nothing. Richard wheeled his wheelchair into the therapy room, which was stocked with brightly colored toys, equipment, and tools after breakfast. Therapists came and went, experimenting with various techniques, images, noises, and even animals. However, Noah said nothing and stayed motionless. Richard kept an eye on each session in the hopes of observing even a slight response. Noah looked around or flinched occasionally, but he never said anything. Richard frequently questioned what he was doing incorrectly. He intended to establish a connection. He desired to hear the voice of his son. Just knowing Noah was trying, even if it wasn't for praise or compensation. Richard felt as though he couldn't break through the wall of quiet. Richard's mind was racing with concerns and inquiries. He read all the books and articles he could find about kids like Noah. He purchased the newest gadgets, flew for appointments, and spoke with medical professionals. He didn't cut any corners in the hopes that one of them will eventually enable his son to speak. He experimented with sign language, music therapy, and speech therapy. Nothing was successful. Richard was disappointed by every failed attempt, but he persisted. He recalled the ease with which business dealings had been managed, the apparent simplicity of logic and statistics. None of that helped now, though, with his own son. Neither money nor reason could convince Noah. Richard stayed up at night, listening to the gentle sounds coming from the baby monitor beside his bed while he stared at the ceiling. He was concerned about what was ahead. When Noah was gone, what would happen to him? Who would be interested in him? Richard felt frightened at the concept. It was the first time in his life that he felt powerless. In spite of everything, Richard persisted. He made another attempt every morning. He spoke to Noah as though he understood everything he said. He informed him about the trees outside, the weather, and even childhood tales. Soft, soothing music that he felt Noah could enjoy was playing in the background. He occasionally played games in the hopes that Noah would be interested. He even experimented with cooking new dishes, since he believed that varied textures or scents might inspire anything. Anything would do: a smile, a sound, a look. However, the quiet persisted. There was no indication that Noah was paying attention. Richard started to think he was the only one making an effort. He had the impression that he was the only one speaking, and Noah had no desire to join in. But he persisted because that was the only way he knew to express love, not because he thought things would change. Noah was his son, silent or not. A few days were more difficult than others. Richard would become irritated, but he would always suppress it. He never became angry or raised his voice. He was aware that Noah was not at fault. Richard did not hold therapists accountable for their failures. Rather, he would express gratitude and carry on looking. He gained a newfound understanding of patience. Time was money in the corporate world. At home, time was just waiting for a moment that would never arrive, waiting for something to happen. Specialists Richard met with advised him not to have high expectations. They spoke softly, using phrases like realistic expectations and acceptance. Though he didn't entirely agree, Richard listened. He secretly thought Noah was more than that. He simply had no idea how to get in touch with him. Every little detail, including Noah's hand movements and facial expressions, was meticulously observed. Richard was constantly searching for hints, indicators, or trends. More essential than anything he had ever done, it became his full-time job. Richard sat next to Noah in the living room one afternoon as sunlight streamed in through the mansion's large windows. Despite his fatigue, he kept it to himself. He observed as he put a tiny toy in Noah's hand. Noah did not respond. Minutes went by. Then, as usual, Richard started talking gently. He related a story regarding his wife's passion of music, long before Noah was born. He told of a day spent at the seashore. He spoke slowly and calmly. He didn't anticipate a response. All he wanted was to be near. He grinned softly as he glanced at Noah. Noah didn't turn around. His gaze stayed far away. The toy dropped to the ground after slipping out of his grasp. Richard took it and returned it to him. No response as of yet. With a sigh, he reclined on the couch and gazed up at the ceiling. They remained silent, and more than anything else, Richard experienced the weight of being a father who merely wants to hear his son speak. At the age of 27, Julia Bennett had just gone through the most terrible time in her life. Her baby daughter passed away not long ago. Nothing could have prepared her for the pain, and it happened all at once. Julia had been fighting to maintain her strength ever since. She didn't discuss it much. Around her, most people stayed away from the subject. It was worse because of the silence. She stayed at home for days, unable to eat or sleep, and unsure of what to do. A few weeks later, she made the decision that she needed to take action in order to feel alive once more. She discovered the employment offer at that point. It was a new beginning, but it wasn't flashy or thrilling. She agreed to work at the Wakefield mansion as a housemaid. Julia didn't give a damn about who lived in the house or how big it was. All she wanted was routine and tranquility. She packed her few possessions and boarded a bus to the new location with quiet resolve. Julia was struck by how silent the mansion was when she first arrived. There was an odd sense that the house was stuck in time. Even though everything was spotless and well organized, Richard Wakefield was the man who met her. He spoke clearly and emotionlessly and was courteous yet aloof. He told her about his son, Noah, and outlined her responsibilities. Julia did not interrupt while she listened. Although she had previously worked in homes, there was something unique about this position. She observed how many items were designed with children in mind as she moved through the rooms and corridors. Soft chairs, toys, colorful books, and therapy equipment. However, there was no sound or laughter. Noah was sitting calmly in his wheelchair and not looking at anyone when she first saw him later. Julia remained silent. She just gave Richard a nod and got to work. She was not anxious, even though she wasn't sure what it was yet. She knew she had come there for a reason. Julia behaved differently, unlike the other employees who had previously worked there. She didn't pretend to be nice or smile at Noah. She didn't try to elicit a response or spoke loudly to him. She just went about her business and remained nearby as necessary. Occasionally, when Noah was around, she cleaned the room. She was careful not to move too fast or create loud noises. She saw how easily he got overwhelmed, but she also saw how at ease he seemed when no pressure was put on him. She therefore appreciated that. She occasionally sat on a nearby chair after finishing her work, doing nothing specific but simply being there. Noah didn't seem to mind her presence, but he also didn't look at her. Richard observed this from afar. He was taken aback. Most new hires gave up too soon or tried too hard. Julia also did not. She simply existed, composed, without expectations or inquiries. And that began to matter somehow. Richard began to notice minor changes over the course of the following several days. Despite her calm demeanor, Julia appeared to infuse the place with a new vitality. Noah didn't have a significant reaction to her. He hardly moved, remained silent, and avoided eye contact. However, something felt simpler. When she walked into the room, he nodded away. When she put anything next to him, he no longer tensed. Richard sensed it, though it was difficult to describe. Julia once put a tiny toy in front of Noah. She simply left it there and went back to cleaning without saying anything. Noah stared at it for a few more seconds than normal, but he didn't touch it. Richard caught sight of it. Julia didn't mention it or say anything. She simply carried on with her task. It was a new, straightforward, courteous attitude. It was the first time Richard had witnessed someone deal with such a situation. It made him wonder about Julia's true identity. Richard gradually started to speak with Julia more. At first, there was little more than courteous inquiries and brief remarks, but she didn't try to impress him. Instead, she answered honestly. After some time, she informed him about her daughter. She did not weep or plead for pity. She just gave an explanation, as if she had come to terms with something unpleasant, but yet wanted to go on. Her honesty stunned Richard. Julia didn't appear to need consolation, but he was at a loss for words. All she wanted was to be heard. His esteem for her increased as a result. Julia developed into more than just a housekeeper over time. She settled into the calm routine of the house. Rather than attempting to break the silence, she blended in with it. Richard was grateful for that. Because he believed that no one else could relate, he had become accustomed to spending time alone with Noah. Julia, however, made no effort to comprehend everything. She simply remained, and that was sufficient. Her presence was helpful, but it didn't solve anything. The most unexpected event took place on a typical afternoon. Noah sat close by, gazing out the window as Julia folded laundry in the living room. She started humming softly without giving it much thought. It was a straightforward tune rather than a song with lyrics. Richard entered and stopped. As usual, he thought Noah would disregard it. However, Noah's head shifted a little this time. It was barely anything, a little inclination in the direction of the sound. Julia didn't even raise her head. She simply continued to hum. Unwilling to interrupt, Richard remained still. A minute later, Noah's fingers began to move slightly. Even though it wasn't much, Richard saw it as everything. It was the first indication that something might be shifting. Julia did not rejoice. After that, she remained silent. She simply continued to work as usual. Richard, however, became aware in that little instant that the stillness between them had changed somewhat and that it had begun the day Julia came to the estate. Julia gradually began to pick up on minor details in Noah's behavior. They didn't seem significant at first. However, she started to notice trends the more time she spent with him. Noah responded to the world in a unique way. He hardly moved, never spoke, and never looked at anyone. However, there were only minor indications. When certain sounds occurred, such as when someone poured a drink of water or when it rained outdoors, he would move his head slightly. He responded differently to speech and music. Although he was more alert to sounds associated with water, Julia began to try this. When cleaning, she would turn the faucet slowly, and she noted that when he heard it, his fingers moved more. She would slightly open a window when it rained, and Noah would sit more comfortably. Julia listened, but it wasn't much. She didn't move quickly. Day by day, she simply continued to observe. She pushed Noah's wheelchair through the garden behind the mansion one afternoon. There were some towering trees, plants, and mowed grass in this peaceful spot. The sky was clear and the air was warm. Julia saw a small shift in Noah's posture as they strolled. He was shifting his fingers and sitting up a bit more. He was staring toward the pool at the far end of the yard, and she could see this by following his gaze. As the filter system circulated the water around, it generated gentle splashing sounds. Julia halted the wheelchair. Noah continued to gaze at the ocean. He had a very slight smile on his lips, but it was closed. Once more, his hands made a little movement, but it was enough to indicate that something was going on inside of him. "You like that, huh?" Julia whispered softly as she leaned down. Naturally, she didn't anticipate a response, but she sensed that he understood. She felt hopeful at that small moment. Perhaps she had discovered something that really spoke to him. Julia made a minor adjustment to their regular schedule after that day. She brought Noah outside for a quick stroll to the pool area every morning after breakfast and before the therapy session. Nothing was forced by her. She wouldn't force Noah to go if he didn't want to one day. However, he remained composed for the most part of the journey. She would park his wheelchair close by in a shaded spot as they approached the river. They listened for a long as they sat there. The water was occasionally slightly shifted by the breeze. Birds occasionally landed nearby. Noah's body language had changed, but he still didn't talk or act like other children. He appeared more at ease. He was less rigid. His fingers worked regularly and slowly. He blinked less, Julia observed. He was intent. She didn't attempt to elevate it above its current state. However, it was obvious that something inside Noah reacted to the water's movement and sound. As the days went by, Julia began to notice even more indications. Near the water, Noah's shoulders loosened. He once swiftly turned his head in the direction of the sound when she splashed her palm lightly into the pool. She had never witnessed him react so quickly. She didn't give it much thought. She simply continued doing what came naturally to her. She would occasionally sit by him and tap the pool's edge with her fingers. At times, she spoke softly to him, simply to keep him company, without anticipating a response. She saw that during these times, his breathing slowed. Later one afternoon, when she was cleaning by the garden, Noah made a quiet noise. It was only a sound, not a word. However, it was novel. It happened immediately after they got back from the swimming pool. Julia stopped. It seemed significant, even though she had no idea what it meant. She hasn't yet told Richard. She wanted to be certain. Julia began to question herself more deeply. What if Noah wasn't the only one who enjoyed the pool? What if it turned into a tool, a means of getting closer to him? She had read that children with specific needs particularly those with sensory problems, could benefit from water treatment. The sounds it produced, the sensation of the water, and the little pressure may be soothing or even invigorating. She didn't want to overthink things, though. She was aware of how simple it was to find purpose in the absence of any. The symptoms were there, though. She thought about talking to Richard, but she was hesitant. He has witnessed numerous pros make mistakes. She didn't want to be simply another individual with a pointless idea. On the inside, though, she sensed that this was more than a hunch. It was real. She had kept a tight eye on Noah, and this was no accident. Those tiny hand gestures and faint smiles were filled with excitement, true joy. After a night of contemplation, Julia made the decision to bring it up one morning. Richard was looking through papers in his office. She waited while knocking. He looked up to see her come in and spoke attentively. She described to him everything she had observed, including Noah's reaction to the pool, his altered hand motions, and his relaxed body. She talked about how Noah seemed lured to the sound of the water. Without interjecting, Richard listened. He didn't dismiss it. But he also didn't respond passionately. "Let's try something," he remarked after a moment. The three of them stepped outside that afternoon. Richard walked next to them, and Julia pushed Noah's wheelchair. As before, they sat by the pool. Julia splashed a little when she touched the water. Noah observed as he always had. Leaning down, Richard examined his son. He noticed the hands moving. He noticed the slight smile. And for the first time, he had the feeling that something could finally be beginning to change. When Julia made the decision to try something new, it was a sweltering late afternoon, with the sun still hanging over the backyard. It had been on her mind for days, perhaps weeks. Noah became more at ease and interested each time she and he went to the pool. He breathed quietly, moved his hands more, and occasionally made quiet noises. Today, however, felt different. Julia prepared a tiny float vest. Richard hadn't explicitly said yes, but he hadn't said no either when she had asked him for permission earlier in the week. For her, that was sufficient. She checked each strap to make sure it fit snugly before carefully assisting Noah into the vest. The fact that he didn't fight was already a victory. She held him close as she sat by the pool's edge, moving slowly. She then carefully descended into the water, holding him by the other arm as they entered together for the first time. The water instantly caused a reaction in Noah's body. He stiffened his arms and raised his shoulders a little. Julia squeezed him closer. She said, "I've got you. It's okay." She didn't move quickly. To give him time to adjust to the new sensation, they lingered on the side of the pool. She sensed a tiny tremor when the water reached his chest. He didn't yell, though. He remained calm. His body adapted slowly. Julia took a small step back, allowing the water to bear more of his weight. Her arm remained securely around his waist, and the float held him upright. A few more seconds later, something was different. His head tipped back, his shoulders lowered, and his hands stroked softly through the water. Then, suddenly, he laughed a little, quickly. It was a brief, unmistakable laugh. Julia's eyes widened as she froze. It was the first time she had heard him make that sound. Her heart leaped. Julia was momentarily at a loss for what to do. She experienced an odd mixture of terror and joy as her chest constricted. She didn't want to respond too strongly and frighten him, but she was unable to stop it. Her eyes welled up with tears, and she let out a low giggle. She continued to hold him while she moved in tiny circles and floated slowly in the water. Noah's expression remained composed. But he didn't laugh again. It appeared to please him. He wasn't rigid. He felt the water as his fingertips traveled over its surface, making a little splashing sound. Julia paid close attention to every little movement, as if it were the most significant thing in the world. She recalled all the times she and he had sat by this pool, hoping for anything. He was now floating, unwinding and giggling. Even though there was only one sound, it meant everything to her. "You did it." "Noah," she whispered to him once more. "You succeeded." Something forced him to pause his work and glance out the window, even though he hadn't intended to walk outdoors. He wasn't convinced about that, because he had seen Julia earlier guiding Noah to the pool. Curious now, he went outside and traced the path. He came to a stop at the edge of the yard. A few meters ahead of him, he could see Julia holding his son while he floated in the water. He was immobile for a moment. He fixed his gaze on the boy's face. He observed Noah's hand movements. He could see how Julia hugged him tenderly. Then the sound reached him. Noah chuckled once more, briefly and lightly. It was clear yet faint. Richard's heart was racing. It was unbelievable to him. His son was giggling, in water, with another person, alongside her. Richard's initial response was one of bewilderment. He was unsure on how to feel. He had always been cautious, guarded, and perhaps overbearing. With Noah, he never had complete faith in anyone. He had never been able to accomplish what Julia was accomplishing now. She had bravely led his son into the sea. He had laughed at her. Richard stepped forward without interjecting. He continued to observe, aware that something was going on that he couldn't ignore. He started to feel less afraid that anything would go wrong, that Noah would be harmed, and that people wouldn't comprehend. He could see Julia wasn't trying to do anything. She was composed, understanding, and totally focused on Noah. She was giving him a sense of security, a knot formed in Richard's throat. He had been waiting for this moment for years, and it wasn't occurring in a particular program, treatment, or with a doctor. Here, in his backyard, it was taking place with a woman who genuinely cared. Julia froze for a moment when she turned to face the garden and found Richard standing there. However, she then gave him a soft nod, seemingly seeking his unspoken consent. He remained silent. He merely gave a nod in return and moved slightly closer while maintaining his distance. Noah was unaware. His thoughts were on Julia's arm around him, the water, and the sensation of floating. Richard took a seat slowly in a chair close by and observed the action. He made no attempt to assume command. He did nothing except observe. There had always been a lot of formal boundaries and unspoken friction between him and Julia. Now, though, something was different. Roles and titles were no longer relevant in this context. It has to do with Noah, and he was grinning for the first time. With a gentle and sensitive look, Julia and the boy continued to move slowly through the water. Finally, while he sat there, Richard realized it wasn't a simple swim. It was the start of something far more significant than dread. Richard approached the pool at a leisurely pace. His heart was pounding rapidly, but his steps were firm. It was the first time he had ever seen his son giggle. Something inside him had been rattled by that alone. His gaze remained fixed on Noah as he approached. Julia held the boy calmly and gently while he continued to float in the water. Richard was careful not to interrupt. Whatever was going on, he didn't want to ruin it. He remained silent, observing every action. Julia also remained silent. With calm hands, she held Noah close. Then an unforeseen event occurred. Noah looked at Richard, who was standing close to the edge. It was a slow, methodical motion. They looked at each other. Then Noah said, "Daddy," in a quiet voice. Only one word. It was little more than a whisper, but it was obvious. Richard stopped. He became motionless. His gaze expanded. He had been looking forward to this day for years. Richard heard the word again. "Dad." It was unbelievable to him. Afraid to breathe for fear that it was all in his head, he gazed at Noah, praying he had heard correctly. However, it was genuine. It had taken place. Richard fell to his knees near the pool's edge when his legs failed him. His hands shook. He didn't give a damn about his appearance or his garments getting wet. Tears uncontrollably fell down his cheeks. Years of suffering, annoyance, anxiety, and powerlessness poured out. For so long, he had been silent, fearing his son would never speak. At least he assured himself that he had come to terms with it. But now everything changed with a single word. With her arms wrapped around Noah, Julia remained motionless in the water. She remained silent. She didn't have to. When her eyes locked with Richard's, they both realized how serious the situation was. There was nothing to explain. That was the type of moment that was self-evident. Noah appeared composed, but he did not repeat the word. His respiration remained steady, and his fingers continued to move slightly in the water. He appeared neither scared nor perplexed. He actually appeared more present than before. Julia kept him comfortable by softly adjusting her grip. Trying to gather his breath, Richard used both hands to wipe his face. He took another look at his son, examining every feature of his face. Noah wasn't simply responding to a moment of solace or the water. He had connected with someone. He had decided to talk after glancing at his father. That meant more than any medical update or therapy report ever could. Richard carefully and slowly reached out and touched Noah's hand. Noah did not retreat. He placed a gentle, light hand there. "Thank you," Richard replied quietly as he turned to face Julia. She didn't respond. Her face was steady and soft as she gave a single nod. Unprepared to stand, Richard took a seat on the ground next to the pool. He desired to remain near. He wished to recollect every moment. His son was still securely in Julia's arms as he watched him soar. He felt less helpless than ever before. He didn't feel uncertain or lost. He experienced a sense of belonging. He came to a significant realization. Speaking had never been a problem for Noah. He had never been totally withdrawn. Simply put, he had never felt secure enough to express himself. Fixing him or teaching him wasn't the goal. Giving him room, a space free from pressure, a space where silence wasn't a failure, was the goal. Julia had taken basic steps to create that space: calm, presence, and patience. Richard had pursued findings for years, searching costly locations for answers. However, the response had been more subdued and silent, the liberty to experience safety, to communicate. When Richard saw Noah move in the sea, he began to believe in true progress for the first time. For several more minutes, Julia and Noah remained afloat. She didn't move quickly. She sensed that the boy's posture had changed. He had faith in her. He was at ease. He wasn't only putting up with it, he was taking part in it. Every little thing he did felt deliberate. When Julia glanced at Richard once again, she noticed a change in his expression. It was more than emotion or shock. It was comprehension. What she had been observing for weeks, he had witnessed. Noah wasn't inaccessible, that the quiet wasn't a barrier, it served as a safeguard. And now that defense had begun to crumble for the first time, nobody was in a rush to get anywhere, so they lingered there a little while longer. Everything seemed to have stopped around them to make room for this one fact. Noah had spoken with his entire being, not just his lips. And for all of them, that moment had altered everything. Noah was carefully led back toward the pool's edge by Julia as the sun started to set. She gently assisted him, using a towel she had prepared to dry him. After silently completing the task, Richard got up and took the towel from her. They put him in his wheelchair and clothed him together. With his head cocked slightly and his eyes wide open and vigilant, Noah was composed. Still reeling from the shock of what had transpired, Richard gazed down at him. Years of stillness had been broken by a single syllable. More significantly, though, it had unlocked a new avenue. When he turned to see Julia, his heart changed. She was no longer only an employee in his eyes. No expert had ever done what she had done. His son had been approached by her. Richard realized then, when the last of the sunshine touched the ground. Today, something had awakened in Julia, in Noah, and in himself. Something lively, something genuine. The house's most significant feature had gradually evolved into the pool. Noah's existence revolved around what had been a peaceful backyard feature. After breakfast every morning, he would gesture to the glass door that led to the backyard with a smile. He would occasionally tap his wheelchair's armrest while glancing at Julia, hoping she would comprehend. It was not difficult. Julia was fully aware of his desires. In silent awe, Richard saw this shift. Previously uninterested in anything, Noah now had a routine that he liked. Noah would sit up straighter as soon as they were outside. His hands would move softly in the air as his eyes focused. As they got closer to the water, he began to make quiet noises, almost like humming. He used it to show his excitement. Richard now frequently joined them, sitting on the edge or standing close by, taking in every little advancement as if it were a holy tidbit. Julia started incorporating fresh ideas into their poolside meetings, with floating toys, some soft, some colorful, and some that made soothing sounds when squeezed. She introduced water activities. She occasionally sang softly to Noah while playing soothing background music. He became more and more reactive. He made gentle splashes, reached for the toys, and occasionally even laughed. He was particularly drawn to a yellow plastic duck toy. With concentration, he watched it float while holding it longer than the others. During their time together, Julia frequently utilized it after noticing it. She also packed simple picture books, which she read aloud by the water's edge. She occasionally named pictures while pointing at them, stopping occasionally to watch for Noah's reaction, which he did. He would tap the pages, make little noises, or touch the illustrations. These movements were no longer random. The answers were unambiguous. The conversation had begun. Always close by, Richard watched with mute appreciation, gradually coming to understand how much his son had been longing to be understood. Then something amazing occurred during one of those afternoon sessions. Noah was sitting on his chair next to Julia, who was sitting on a blanket by the pool. She gave him the yellow duck that he knew so well. After examining it, Noah turned to face her. "Duck," he responded without hesitation, pointing at the toy. He spoke clearly yet quietly. Julia stopped. It was unclear to her whether she had heard accurately. "Duck," she said again, gesturing to it. Noah gave the item a quick glance and gave a small nod. "Duck," he repeated. He had never spoken a second word before. Julia turned to Richard, who had heard and seen everything from a few feet away, and smiled while fighting back tears. His face transformed in an instant, a combination of shock, delight, and incredulity. He approached Noah and knelt next to him. Softly he murmured, "That's right, duck." Not just because of the word, but because of what it meant. It was a moment of joy. More significantly, Noah was making the decision to speak. The sessions by the pool were even more memorable after that day. Regardless of how hectic his schedule was, Richard found time for them each day. He stopped observing from afar. He took part. He sat on the floor to read stories, assisted in drying off toys, and eventually participated on the games when he was comfortable enough. Julia continued to lead in a composed manner, never pressuring things along and always allowing Noah lead the way. In response, the youngster made noises, smiled, and made more eye contact than he had previously. He was obviously communicating, but he didn't say anything more. He fluttered his hands and made noises when he was happy. When he was lost, he turned to Julia for guidance. He made a little laugh and stroked the page when he enjoyed a story. To Richard and Julia, they were significant steps, but to others, they were insignificant things. It was no longer only a place to play in the pool area. Noah felt free, connected and safe there. Julia started writing in a notebook. She took notes whenever Noah pointed at something, made a new sound or answered a tale. Richard carefully examined the notes once she gave them to him. Together, they discussed fresh tactics, books to try, and toys to introduce. They collaborated well, always concentrating on Noah's favorite activities. Julia placed a plastic mat on the ground and took finger paints to the poolside one day. To their amazement, Noah didn't draw away as she led his hands through the colors. When Richard dipped his own fingers into the paint, he even grinned. He stroked the paper, smearing yellow and blue together. They played with bubbles once more, and Noah reached for them with real enthusiasm. These were not merely recreational pursuits. They served as building blocks. Noah learned about cause and effect, texture and communication from each of them. And day by day, his own speech was gradually becoming more understandable. Even though Noah still spoke slowly and frequently made small noises, gestures, and facial expressions, it was no longer important. Julia and Richard had developed varied listening skills. They no longer demanded flawless pronunciation or complete sentences. They comprehended the silent giggles, the hand gestures, and the pauses. It was a new language, one that had been developed through trust and patience. Noah was not being taught how to be someone else for the first time. They were encouraging him to be himself. At last, Richard realized that his son didn't require repair. He had to be heard. Instead of expecting him to be there, he required others to meet him where he was. And that was what Julia had given him. She had built a link between comprehension and quiet. Noah rested his head on Julia's arm while the three of them sat by the pool that afternoon. She grinned. Richard also grinned. The connection was genuine, yet the words were few. At last, someone was listening to the boy. Julia discovered a locked drawer in the workplace while arranging some bookcases. Without giving it any thought, she unlocked Richard's desk drawer and discovered the key inside. There were several old envelopes and files within. Most of them didn't matter. Bills, insurance records, and historical documents. However, one folder caught our attention. The title was Noah Medical History. After hesitating, Julia opened it. When she did, a neurologist who had been treating Noah for years showed her dozens of records. Her expression shifted as she read them. She didn't understand the papers. Descriptions of drugs and processes. Frequently used terms included behavioral suppression, compliance reinforcement, and emotional containment. For extended periods, the doctor had prescribed a lot of medication, not for therapy, but for control. Julia continued to read, her hands shaking. Restricting physical contact, isolating Noah during episodes, and minimizing stimulation were all mentioned in the notes. The report seemed inhumane and frigid. There was a serious problem. What Julia had read was too much to ignore. It grew worse as she turned more pages. In order to guarantee safety and reduce resistance, one report even suggested utilizing a restraining chair during sessions. Word development is rare, according to the notes, and Noah's silence was permanent. The fact that all of these choices had been accepted without inquiry, however, was what disturbed her the most. Instead of being viewed as a child to be understood, Noah had been viewed as a problem to be managed. Julia looked further. She found reviews, articles, and medical board complaints when she searched for the neurologist's name online. She was horrified to learn that other families had reported similar incidents. Children who experienced physical and psychological negative effects as a result of taking too many medications. Despite previous probes, the doctor kept up his practice. Julia was ill. She shut the folder and sat silently, pondering her options. She was aware that she couldn't hide this. Julia waited until Noah was sleeping later that night. With her folder in hand, she entered Richard's study. When he looked up from his reading on the couch, he noticed her grave demeanor. She took a seat opposite him and started to describe all that she had discovered. She didn't mince words. She showed him her research and read him the most unsettling passages from the papers. After listening silently for a while, Richard became clearly shaken. He sat forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands over his lips as his face went pale. He had placed faith in that physician. He thought he was doing what was best for his son for years. He now understood that he had permitted therapies that could have harmed Noah. He had signed the paperwork, paid for it, and never asked enough questions. Guilt was settling in quickly and more heavily than ever before. When he did ask, "How could I not have known?" his voice cracked. She recognized the anguish in his eyes and realized how simple it was to put your faith in those with solemn titles and white coats. However, she also thought it was time to take action. Richard concurred. They were unable to remain silent. They came up with a plan together. They first collected all of the documents, printed all of the articles, and preserved other families' testimonies. They then got in touch with a lawyer that focused on medical malpractice and ethics. A journalist who had written about medical systems with flaws was also contacted. Noah was no longer the exclusive focus. They wanted to prevent the same nightmare from happening to other kids. It was a slow and emotionally taxing process. They provided statements, conducted interviews, and assisted with the inquiry. Richard's guilt returned each time they went through the files again. He didn't flee from it, though. He had an opportunity to correct what he had permitted for too long. This was not about retaliation, he understood. It was about protection and the truth. Even while the lawsuit was stressful, life with Noah went on at home. Richard and Julia didn't allow their mission get in the way of his everyday activities. They actually become more noticeable than before. Now, every little time spent with him felt even more significant. Noah continued to advance. He made eye contact more frequently now, although he still preferred sounds and gestures. He occasionally used new phrases and gestured toward items he desired. He held one and said, "Ball," one day when he was playing by the water. "Read," he urged another time, reaching for a book. Every second served as a reminder that his intellect was active, developing, and learning. He wasn't damaged. Never had he been. Richard now regarded him with respect rather than sympathy or concern. Julia also took note. Although the earlier pain was true, the story did not end there. The future of Noah remained uncertain. After several months, the case proceeded. More family came forward, and news reports were released. While the investigation was ongoing, the doctor's license was suspended. Richard and Julia received multiple invitations to speak in public. They refused to give up. Even if it was difficult, they spoke on Noah's behalf and on behalf of all the children who had been handled more like a case file than a human being. They became closer to one another at home. Employer and employee no longer applied. They worked together as a team since they had the same objective of keeping someone they both loved safe. Noah continued to explore his surroundings, one small step at a time, oblivious to the storm his parents were fighting outside. It was easier for him to smile now. He continued to laugh, and it was evident to both of them that this youngster, who had before been quieted by miscommunication and fear, was regaining his voice when he uttered Julia for the first time. Noah was being released slowly but steadily. Richard and Julia put everything they had into moving forward with the help of other parents. What started out as a private investigation had evolved into a public quest for justice. They visited with families who had also been mistreated by the same physician. They collected all the documents they could locate and listened to terrible stories. Together, they gathered prescriptions, expert opinions, testimony, and medical records. A group of reporters took up the issue and started writing reports. More individuals began to hear the truth. The scandal was covered by news outlets, and internet sites aided in the rapid dissemination of the tale. The papers formally named the doctor, who was charged with unethical practices and disregarding the health of his patients. The pressure increased as authorities launched an official probe. However, without the efforts of Richard and Julia, none of this would have been possible. After the truth was revealed, they continued. They ensured that everyone who needed to hear it would do so. Things inside the mansion were changing, but in a different way, as the outside world responded. Noah kept his voyage silent while reporters called and attorneys took comments. He made steady development. Julia started to take notice of his sketches. They were merely shapes and lines at first, but eventually colors began to emerge. He made use of green, yellow, and blue. He picked his colors carefully. On the wall by the swimming pool, Richard displayed a few of the drawings. One day, Noah held a crayon and stated, "Water." He looked out the window and muttered, "Sunday." Another day. Then, without warning, he added, "Mom." Julia heard it, but it was quick and subtle. Richard also heard it. Both of them exchanged a startled and moved glance. Neither therapy nor pressure led to these words. Noah himself provided them. The youngster who used to live in total silence was suddenly sharing his feelings, memories, and thoughts. They weren't teaching him to talk. He was just being allowed room to develop. Richard was sitting close by reading paperwork one afternoon as Julia was sorting books, when Noah entered the room with a piece of paper. He had spent some time using crayons to draw. With a smile, Julia inquired if he would want to show them. With the paper in his little fists, Noah approached them gently. They both leaned in as he held it up. 3 stick people holding hands were depicted on the paper. One had long hair, one had short hair, and the third, in the center, had curly lines on top of the head and a rounder face. They knew exactly what it meant. Julia knelt down and inquired, "Who are these?" After glancing over the drawing, Noah turned to face them both. "That's us," he said. Although he spoke softly, his words were understandable. Tears welled up in Julia's eyes. She nodded and put her hand over her mouth. Richard remained silent. He simply gazed at the illustration, experiencing a profound and overpowering sensation within himself. Julia sat on the floor beside Noah and gave him a tender hug. Just enough, not too tight. He did not retreat. Before returning to his crayons, he briefly placed his head on her shoulder. Richard said nothing and continued to observe. His heart was overflowing. What he had formerly feared was silence, but now it was wonderful. It wasn't always a perfect day. It was acceptable when Noah was silent or didn't want to chat on certain days. The distinction was that they now comprehended him. Even in the absence of speech, they were able to listen. Richard was proud of what they had created together, not just of Noah. Julia was no longer merely a help. Now she was a member of the family. Something he believed was lost forever had been restored with her assistance. They were living different lives, once chilly and silent. The house was now a place of color, noise, and genuine connection. The recollections were still painful. The past did not vanish. Richard would occasionally feel the burden of guilt again while looking through the old medical records. Even though Julia still occasionally thought about her daughter and experienced the grief of her absence, neither of them allowed the agony to rule their present. Rather, they used it to maintain their focus, continue assisting Noah, and keep others safe. They persisted in attending meetings, engaging with the other families, and giving case updates. They addressed support groups, spoke at events, and responded to letters from individuals experiencing similar difficulties. They were no longer hiding. Others were benefiting from Noah's narrative. In exchange, they heard tales from parents who had regained hope. It all served as a reminder to Richard and Julia that their work was important. They had transformed something sinister into something truthful, something that would actually transform the lives of many people. There has never been more life in the house. When Noah enjoyed a meal, his laughter filled the kitchen. Toys, books, and colorful papers were all over the floor of the living room. The walls were covered in Noah's artwork, and the hallway had the scent of freshly painted walls. On some days, they just sat outdoors by the pool and listened to the sounds of the water as music played in the background. Richard stopped trying to escape the recollections of what had been lost. Noah, the focal point of it all, had found his place in the world, and Julia no longer concealed her emotions. He smiled widely, talked a little, and drew a lot. Something changed forever that day when he showed them the drawing and said, "It's us." It wasn't just a moment of sweetness. It was evidence. There was no longer any reason to fear the silence. There were now voices, stories, and love in that house that had formerly been a place of loneliness and suffering. Although the present had become a home, the past had left scars. The neurologist's trial gained public notice more quickly than anyone had anticipated. More families came forward with their own heartbreaking stories after the initial allegations were publicized. The sessions were held in a crowded courtroom. Parents talked about how their kids had been over-medicated, misdiagnosed, or unnecessarily confined. The evidence was overwhelming. Official documents, expert testimony, and medical records all clearly demonstrated a history of abuse and neglect. Julia and Richard attended each session. With all the truth they had gathered, they spoke strongly and quietly. Reporters kept a close eye on the situation. Every day, articles were published. There was a powerful public response, and social media further raised awareness. There was no room for question when the final decision was rendered. The physician was condemned after being found guilty on several counts. It was a moment of justice for all the children who had endured silent suffering, not just Noah. Although Richard and Julia didn't publicly celebrate, they both felt relieved on the inside. Life felt so different at home. Away from the bustle of the courtroom, there was a gentle buzz of activity in the home that had previously reverberated with solitude. Shortly after the trial started, Richard had made up his mind. He created an art studio exclusively for Noah in one of the vacant rooms. In order to let sunlight into the room, he painted the walls white and added wide windows. Paints, crayons, markers, and colorful paper were on the shelf. Noah was able to sit comfortably and draw thanks to a low table and chairs. Julia assisted with the setup. Noah's eyes glowed when he entered the room for the first time. He selected a crayon and started drawing after running his fingers over the shelves. It became his favorite spot in the house after that day. He would head straight to the studio after breakfast every morning. He sketched people, animals, shapes, and most importantly, the things he was most passionate about. Sunlight, water, and pool blue, his favorite hue. Julia was no longer merely an ordinary part of life. She belonged to the family. Her relationship with Noah has only gotten closer. She knew how to support him without pressuring him. When he needed calm and when he was ready to attempt new things, on certain days he sketched and she sung. At other times, they read books on the floor or painted together. Without being prompted, Noah had already begun to name colors. He would point to a bright color and remark, "Red, yellow, blue." He loved to say blue, but pool blue was his favorite way to describe the gentle turquoise hue of the water he loved. He would enthusiastically scribble the paper with the crayon, pressing it firmly against it. Sometimes he would describe his sketches when Julia smiled and asked him to. Words gradually entered their games. Richard E., occasionally holding a cup of coffee, would frequently observe them from the doorway in silence. He didn't talk over you. With gratitude for the long-awaited quiet, he simply watched. The peaceful halls and therapy rooms were no longer the only places in Noah's universe. He played with modest toys, explored the garden, and occasionally assisted Julia in baking cookies. As he moved around the studio, he sung little, made-up songs, caused messes, and got paint on his clothes. The voids that formerly felt empty were filled by his laughing. Richard became aware of the changes in his home. Everywhere there were traces of life, books left open on the couch, toys beneath the table, and artwork on the walls. It didn't appear to be a museum anymore. It had a lived-in feel. It was warm. Richard had begun to smile more, not merely as a courtesy, but because he was genuinely delighted. The same thing he believed he had lost was now present in his home, after he had endured so much suffering, remorse, and quiet. Joy. Real, but not flawless or steady. He had learned from Julia and Noah that recovery didn't have to be dramatic. All it had to do was be truthful. The three of them had created a new kind of family without having to express it out. There were no expectations or designations, simple routines, peaceful afternoons, shared dinners, and little things had all provided them some solace. Although they each carried burdensome memories from the past, they were working together to create something fresh. Richard never asked Julia to replace what had been lost, and Julia never made an effort to do so. She simply existed, steady and present. That was met with trust from Noah. He sketched an image of three people lounging in the sun one afternoon. "Daddy," he replied, pointing to the tallest, followed by Julia, who had long hair, and me, who was smaller. That drawing remained on Richard's desk. It made him realize that even when all else had crumbled, love could still flourish. The plot didn't have to resemble anyone else's. It simply had to be real. And whatever it was absolutely real. Although there was no ideal finale or last chapter, there was something better: stability, a new rhythm, and a calm home. Even now, when he thought back on the years he had lost or the mistakes he had made, Richard still had moments of uncertainty, though such times did not define them. Julia continued to quietly weep her own suffering. The way they gazed at each other at the dinner table, the way Noah grabbed for their hands as they walked around the yard, and the way their lives had merged organically without any effort on their part, were what now characterized them. Once so quiet and chilly, the house now had purpose. A half-finished jigsaw on the floor, paintings on the refrigerator, and music playing on the speaker. Richard only needed to be there. He no longer needed to search for solutions. And he came to a straightforward realization one afternoon as he stood there and watched Julia and Noah giggle together in the light. Love was here. Silently, slowly, as a product of time, truth, and care, not as a reward. The days of finger-painting in the studio and peaceful afternoons by the pool had long since faded. The little child who remained silent and spoke only a few words was no longer Noah. He had developed into a self-assured young man with a distinct voice, hobbies, and personality. Friends were the first to tell his story, followed by neighborhood associations and the national media. People were motivated by his progress. Now, visitors, families, and professionals from all across the nation crowded into a sizable auditorium. They had gathered to honor tales of tenacity and development. Wearing his favorite color, a bright blue suit, Noah was among those recognized that evening. He and Julia waited backstage. He was excited rather than anxious. His smile remained broad, despite his hands fidgeting a bit. Julia gave him a proud expression. She fixed his collar with the same gentleness, patience, and love that she had used to correct his paintings years before. Noah held Julia's hand as he moved carefully onto the stage at the appointed moment. Even before he got to the microphone, the audience got up and cheered. Despite the glaring stage lights, he remained unflinching. He stood erect and gazed fearlessly at the audience. For someone who had previously been confined to silence, the voyage was symbolized by the placement of a medal around his neck. Julia was standing next to him, her eyes welling with tears. Richard was sitting in the front row with his hands on his knees and a proud smile. What followed, however, took everyone by surprise. The presenter held up a paper after clearing his throat. He stated that we commemorate today not just Noah's journey, but also the individual who accompanied him on every step of the way. Join me in formally acknowledging Julia Bennett as Noah Wakefield's adoptive mother and legal guardian. The room became utterly silent for a moment. Then, as the passion overcame her, Julia put both palms over her lips. Julia had never requested praise. She had never thought about a ceremony or a title. She had just supported Richard, Noah, and the small things that made their life meaningful from the start. However, as she stood there now, the announcement still ringing in her ears, she sensed a change. Noah turned to face her and embraced her. It was more than a simple hug. It was brimming with genuine love, gratitude, and faith. Julia sobbed aloud. Her entire body shook, and she started crying uncontrollably. "Thank you," she whispered, resting her forehead on Noah's. Richard got up in the crowd and started clapping. They were followed by others until everyone in the audience stood up. The cheers were long, loud, and passionate. After a few seconds of holding hands, Julia and Noah turned back to face the presenter. The scene, which would be featured in news reports and internet posts as a representation of tenderness, endurance, and unwavering love, was photographed. The host gave Noah a small piece of paper after the announcement. It was his turn to speak. Holding the paper in both hands, he approached the microphone and turned to face the crowd. He inhaled deeply. Then he said, "My light started at the pool," in a calm and clear voice. He smiled and pointed to Julia with her. It was straightforward and true. There were no long sentences or difficult terminology. There was utter silence in the room. They held their breath. For a moment, even the cameras ceased to click. Then, as if suddenly, the quiet was broken by cheers, loud clapping, and even some audience members' tears. Overcome with emotion, Richard wiped his eyes with a tissue and sat down again. He had fantasized of this moment during his worst years, and now it had come true. Not only was Noah being seen, but he was also being celebrated, listened, and understood according to his own terms. A reception was held in the foyer following the ceremony. To meet Noah and Julia, people waited in line. Teachers expressed gratitude, parents asked questions, and passers-by expressed how much their story moved them. Julia listened politely, feeling moved but a little overwhelmed. Noah grinned at everyone, occasionally nodding and occasionally responding in a low voice. After some time, Richard joined them and stood next to them, just as Noah's father, not as a businessman or a leader. As a group, the three of them stood. Anyone observing could see that they were a family, united not by blood, but by years of shared experiences, difficult decisions, and gradual triumphs. Of course, Noah's life still had its share of difficulties. He still experienced days of silent bewilderment and hardship. The difference now, though, was that he wasn't by himself. Even when the rest of the world failed to comprehend, he had two people at his side who never gave up on their faith. As the family departed together, the event came to a conclusion with a final round of applause, laughter, and pictures. With Julia's hand in one and Noah's medal in the other, they entered the vehicle. Every now and then, Richard looked back at them in the mirror as he drove. Not much needed to be said. The quiet between them felt rich and cozy. Noah put the medal on the table beside one of his old drawings, the one with the three of them holding hands, when they returned home. Glancing at it, Julia grinned. Noah leaned against both of them as Richard wrapped his arm around her. As usual, Julia tucked Noah in before bed that night. "Good night, Mom," he whispered quietly as she switched off the light. Her heart was full, and she hesitated for a moment. "Good night," she muttered, "my love." The world was silent outside, but all that remained was love and tranquility in the house where it all started. At last, the story has come to a close. That you've come this far makes me very happy. I sincerely appreciate you viewing. What did you think was the best or worst part? Please share your thoughts here. Remember to subscribe. Till the next occasion.